Warringah.
I move that this bill be read a second time. This bill that I present today reflects the government's very own bill that was introduced in December last year. I introduce this bill now to ensure that there are no excuses in relation to delay, that the provisions to ensure we have guardrails around truth in political advertising can be in place in time for the next election. We know that when it was introduced last term, the government, at the request of the Australian Electoral Commission, included a delay, an implementation, arguing it would take time. But now, by introducing this bill today, and I would argue passing it without delay, at the beginning of this 48th Parliament, it provides enough time for the Commission to implement it prior to the next election. So I do call on the government to make good its very own promises and pledge during the 47th Parliament to do this very action. We are now, this is the very first opportunity. So by putting it forward now, we really are saying to the government there is no excuse but to get on with the job of putting guardrails around misinformation and disinformation in political advertising. We know misinformation and disinformation for political advertising is a loophole that has been taken advantage of for too long. Politicians need to be held to the same standard as consumer laws. We know that we protect consumers from being scammed out of their money from misleading and deceptive advertising. It is time for political advertising to be held to the same standard. Over the past 3 elections, we've seen a huge rise in misinformation and disinformation election time, but also third-party organisations and external campaigners involved in our election. All too often, it is this astroturfing that leads to a huge amount of misinformation. These organisations are running a huge amount of advertising which is misleading and deceptive, but there is no accountability for these players. This type of advertising, there is no doubt, it influences voters, and yet there is no public accountability for them because there simply is no provision in our laws, which people are always astounded to find out. Yet 89% of Australians, when surveyed, support truth in political advertising law. They support that political advertising should be held to the very same standard as all other advertising. On top of that, we're now seeing the growth of AI and deepfakes in political advertising. We saw in 2020-22 the use of AI depicting and changing imagery. We know through AI and deepfakes you can create an ad alleging someone has said something that is completely false and fabricated, and there are no protections on voters. So again, to really put some guardrails to protect our democracy, I call on the Albanese government to support this bill. This is their very own bill from the last Parliament. We know that there is a huge amount of need for this because it really it has been recommended. The Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters will review the latest election, no doubt, but already for the previous election it recommended that something has to be done around misleading and deceptive political advertising. We know there is a huge problem. The question is there a political will to fix it? There really is no excuse. There is a 3 years ahead of time, and there is an opportunity on the government to make good its promise to do this. We know around the world already that it is increasing. In the UK, there is an organisation already pushing for there to be guardrails around misinformation in political advertising. We know the Welsh Parliament has also seen the introduction of legislation. It exists in New Zealand. We have it here in the ACT, and South Australia has it. There is no doubt that there is a consensus for this. For example, we know deepfake videos are incredibly damaging and they spread like wildfire. And so unless guardrails are put in place, we are going to see a continual erosion of trust in politics and the outcomes of election. There is no valid reason why political advertising should be held to a different standard to other advertising. We already have courts that can adjudicate on statements. We can have, and to be very clear, this does not outlaw or rule out opinions. Opinions can be expressed, but they need to be clearly identified as opinions, not fact. And so this is often, an excuse put forward is the idea of free speech. The High Court has said free speech is not the right to lie. It is not a right to mislead. And that's why it is so important that we put these guardrails in place, because we are seeing the growth of so many other participants at our elections, and they are not constrained by any provisions. There is simply no tool available to make sure they do not spread lies and misinformation. We know, for example, they don't have a candidate on the ballot paper, so they know they are not going to have any consequences to be exposed for lying. And that is why it's so important that we do this. For example, to Labor for its own consequences, in 2020, one of Australia's first political deepfake videos emerged of the then Queensland Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, claiming that the state was cooked and in massive debt. That was viewed 1 million times on YouTube. It is really important that we have these guardrails in place. I can only say that if the government chooses not to progress electoral communication reform in this term of parliament without delay, doing it very quickly now before the end of this year to ensure it can be implemented and in place in time for the next election. If it chooses not to do so, with its large majority and its capacity to pass this legislation in both houses already, it says it wants to lie to the Australian people. It wants to keep the loopholes going so that it can do misleading and deceptive advertising to the Australian people at election time. We know this is a loophole that political parties have enjoyed taking advantage of when it is convenient. But the erosion of trust in politics, in outcomes of elections, in policy positions, it is really important that we address this. So I commend this bill to the House.
Is the motion second? And I call the member for Curtin.
I second the motion. This bill is not just about electoral reform, it's about restoring integrity, trust and truth in our democracy and protecting voters. We've seen a steady decline over 20 years in voter satisfaction with democracy and trust in government and political efficacy, and allowing lies in political ads doesn't help. The member for Warringah and I, along with other crossbench members, have long advocated for stronger safeguards against misinformation in political advertising. In the 47th Parliament, we pushed for legislation that would prohibit materially misleading electoral communications. The member for Warringah introduced 2 bills on this topic, and my Restoring Trust Bill and my Fair and Transparent Elections Bill both address the issue too. The government did eventually introduce a bill to address this, but it lapsed with the dissolution of Parliament, and the need for it has only grown more urgent. This is important unfinished business, so we're reintroducing the government's bill so we can get on with it, and we need to do it now so it can be in place before the next election. We need this bill to be debated and passed because lies in political advertising are corrosive. They distort public debate, manipulate voters and undermine the democratic process. In other areas of public communication, the public's protected. Whether it's consumer advertising or financial advice, there are laws against misleading communications. Yet in politics, where the stakes are high, we allow lies to flourish unchecked. In his submission to the JSCAM committee, Professor George Williams argues, truth is fundamental to democracy. When citizens cannot tell fact from fiction and leaders spread falsehoods for political advantage, society as a whole is damaged. Now, this bill would prohibit materially misleading electoral content, including where AI or other digital technologies are used to mislead. It would also establish an electoral communications panel to oversee compliance and provide a fair, independent mechanism for enforcement. Now, this would only apply to purported statements of fact. Parties and other political players would still be free to express their opinions. That's really important, and freedom of speech would not be impeded. This bill is actually based on a framework that's existed in South Australia for 25 years. And that law is seen as being proportionate and not in breach of any freedoms. We're showing that it can be done. This is not a radical idea. The rise of deep fakes and synthetic media is not a distant threat. It is very much here now. And if we don't act now, we risk losing the public's trust, not just in politicians, but in the democratic process itself. I commend the member for Warringah for her leadership and persistence on this issue, and I urge all members of this House to support this bill. Let's show Australians that we are serious about protecting democracy in the digital age. Thank you.